Hey, what's up guys? Welcome to a complete and updated Neuvillette guide. Neuvillette, or Neuvillette if you speak French, is a 5-star Hydro main DPS who has been at the top of the meta ever since he came out. Neuvillette is an incredible and very powerful character that we are going to talk about today, going in depth on how to build and play him. In fact, we're going to cover his best artifacts, weapons, teams, constellations, playstyle, and much more, just in time for his rerun, where there have been a lot of new characters that synergize well with him, making him even better than he already was. Before we begin, I want you guys to know that I do stream most nights on Twitch, link in the description if you're interested. Excuse the slight audio change that's gonna happen right after this clip. And without further ado, let's talk about Neuvillette. Alright, so starting things off, let's talk about what Neuvillette actually does, cover the basics, and also some advanced gameplay tips. So firstly, as for his abilities, here's what you need to know. Neuvillette is a character with unique charge attacks that are the main source of his damage. By holding down your attack button, Neuvillette will charge up an empowered charge attack, taking quite some time to build up the energy before firing a giant hydro beam. This charge attack will deal immense amount of damage while constantly applying hydro, with his damage ticking very fast on all the enemies in front of you that are covered by this massive and thick beam. I don't know why I described it like that, but let's keep it going. This hydro beam will last for 3 seconds and not consume any stamina. Neuvillette's charge attack has good damage and also good AoE because of the size of the hydro beam. Now, while charging it is dreadfully slow, if you are just holding down your mouse button and waiting for your charge attack to charge up, the main part of his abilities are generating these hydro balls on the ground called source water droplets that help make your Neuvillette's charge attacks charge up faster or even instantly. In fact, here's what you need to know. Firstly, Neuvillette's elemental skill will deal some AoE hydro damage and then generate 3 source water droplets. Each source water droplet that you absorb will make your charge attack charge up faster, with 3 source water droplets allowing you to charge it up instantly. Because of this, you always want to try to use your charge attack when 3 source water droplets are nearby, allowing you to fire immediately. While your skill generates 3 source water droplets, your burst will actually generate 6, meaning that you can do 2 charge attacks instantly from your burst and 1 from your skill. Now, it is worth pointing out that your skill does have a fairly low cooldown of 12 seconds, with your burst having an 18-second one, meaning that in a general rotation, you can usually use your skill twice and your burst once, meaning you'll generate up to 12 source water droplets, allowing you to get up to 4 charge attacks that you can use instantly. Something else to note about Neuvillette's unique charge attacks is that while you are firing this giant hydro beam, Neuvillette will continuously lose some HP if he's above 50% HP. What this means is that a healthy Neuvillette over half HP will constantly have his HP draining as he is charge attacking. With that said, when you then absorb the source water droplets for your next charge attack, these source water droplets will heal him up quite a bit. What this means in practice is that Neuvillette is someone who will drain his own HP but will also heal it back up very easily, making him a self-sustained DPS, and part of the reason why you may have seen so many people solo clearing content with just Neuvillette. I also want to add a note that Neuvillette does have a normal charge attack if you just kind of short hold it and fire it off immediately, but this is not a good one and it scales with attack, so it's not one you want to do. His empowered charge attack is one that will scale with HP, and so will his skill and burst, so that's why you're typically building him HP and crit, as we'll cover later. He's an HP scaling character. You don't want to be doing his attack scaling stuff like his normal uncharged up charge attack. Now, outside of just these source water droplets, your skill and burst will deal a decent amount of AoE hydro damage. It's really nothing compared to your charge attacks and how much they do, but it's a bigger hit that you might be able to trigger a reaction such as vaporize with, so it's nice to use. But again, the main purpose of your other abilities outside of your charge attacks are to generate these source water droplets on top of dealing a bit of bonus damage and applying a bit of hydro. As for your skill, it'll be nice to generate some energy for you, and it will also deal a hit of Numa aligned damage, which can help disable certain Fontaine enemy mechanics. Now, as for Neuvillette's passives, he actually has one really important one. Neuvillette's first Ascension passive is one that will give an increased scaling to his unique charge attack. In fact, anytime you trigger any hydro reaction, namely Vaporize, Frozen, Electrocharge, Bloom, Hydro Swirl, or Hydro Crystallize, so any hydro reaction, Neuvillette will gain 1 stack of his passive that will last for 30 seconds. He can get up to 3 stacks, and each of these stacks will increase his charge attack Equitable Judgments scaling. This will make it deal either 110%, 125, or 160% of its original damage, and once again, this isn't just damage bonus you're gaining, which is nice but has diminishing returns. This is really an increase to your charge attack scaling, making it a big increase in damage and a passive that you shouldn't neglect. Because of this, you want to trigger different hydro reactions with Neuvillette. You won't get multiple stacks by triggering the same reaction multiple times, so if you trigger Vaporize 3 times, for example, you won't get 3 stacks of this passive. It is worth emphasizing though that while these stacks are very nice because again they increase your scaling, it can sometimes be worth losing out on a stack attack to get a better team. While obviously increasing your charge attack damage is great, running a bad support just for this passive isn't usually recommended. Because of this, there are some teams where running 2 of the same element can be worth sacrificing 1 stack of your first passive. Losing out on a stack of it to get a strong support character that will help you can be worth it. So typically you'll be getting either 2 or 3 stacks on this passive. It's not the only thing you're focusing on, but it is definitely nice and will influence how you're building a team. For Neuvillette's second passive talent, here he'll gain up to 30% hydro damage bonus based on his current HP. In fact, he'll gain 0.6% for each 1% of his current HP that's higher than 30% of his max HP, basically just making him do a bit more damage when he's higher HP. Lastly, before moving on, regarding Neuvillette's talent priority, your normal attacks are the highest priority to level, as increasing the level of this talent will increase your charge attack scaling as well, which is the main source of Neuvillette's damage by far. Outside of that, leveling his burst and then his skill can be nice for bonus damage too, but you really don't have to overdo it. It is worth pointing out though that leveling your Neuvillette to 90 because he's an HP scaling character is important and recommended as well. Now, moving on, for some more advanced tips and a review of Neuvillette, here's what you need to know. Firstly, you can animation cancel Neuvillette's charge attack when there are 3 source water droplets next to you. You can hold down your charge attack button and then let go of it immediately as you've sucked in the 3 balls. Don't take that out of context. Immediately firing off your charge attack. Outside of that, it's worth noting that Neuvillette's a character who has not just a ton of personal and team damage, but also really good AoE. His beam is very long, it has a long range, making it big enough to be able to hit anything in front of him, while also being able to spin around basically as fast as you want, hitting everything around you. Some of it is done as a joke, but genuinely you can literally just spin with Neuvillette, hit anything around you as your beam is constantly ticking, making his AoE potential almost infinite. But for normal people, you typically just want to line up enemies and then use your beam. Obviously, rotation wise, you want to start by applying hydro, typically with Neuvillette, swapping to your support characters, maybe swirling it, crystallizing it, triggering as many hydro reactions as you can to maximize Neuvillette's passive while also buffing him, using your support character's abilities, and then swapping back to your Neuvillette using your skill and your burst. Typically, you can use 2 skills per rotation, and once buffed, you want to spend as much time as you can using your Neuvillette's charge attack, trying to back up from enemies using your range to your advantage, especially if you don't have a shield or his first constellation and want to prevent getting interrupted. Be sure you are buffing your Neuvillette though by, for example, swirling hydro with Kazuha to make sure you're doing as much damage with your charge attacks, as Neuvillette is really going to be a huge chunk of your team's damage. He is undoubtedly a hyper carry and a really strong one at that, who is pretty simple to play. You just want to trigger hydro reactions, build a good team that can support him, and just fire off a massive laser. Something important to mention about his rotations though is that you can swap out of Neuvillette in the middle of it to refresh a lot of buff durations. This is because his skill has a 12-second cooldown, meaning his rotations will typically be around 24 or 25 seconds. That is a pretty long time where Neuvillette can do damage, but some buffs may expire. For example, the Verdescent Venerer set, which triggers once you swirl an element, will give you a huge buff that lasts for 10 seconds. This means that in practice, you want to refresh it in the middle of your Neuvillette's rotation, starting your rotation off by buffing your Neuvillette, then going on him, using some charge attacks, and then in the middle of your rotation, you can swap out, reapply certain buffs, maybe resummon Fischl's Oz, re-swirl Hydro with Kazuha, using just some of your faster and shorter duration support abilities, not having to do a full new rotation, and then swapping back to your Neuvillette and using his fully buffed charge attacks once again. And this freedom to swap in and out of Neuvillette is just another one of his many strengths and something that you should use to your advantage. For some other tips to mention regarding Neuvillette's charge attacking, it is worth pointing out that he is someone who can be interrupted while he's charge attacking. That's why I recommend kiting away from enemies, as mentioned earlier, or just running a shielder. While there are other forms of interruption resistance outside of just a shield, like Dea's Field, which we'll cover later in the video, these are things that can be nice, and so can a comfy shield, like running someone like Zhongli alongside Neuvillette, and some people might need it more than others. If you're someone who wants to play and not have to think too much, then having a shield can be great, but I do believe there are ways to stay far away from an enemy and be able to run Neuvillette without a shield, even without his first constellation, which will alleviate your need or desire for a shield completely. With that in mind, some enemies are very aggressive and very annoying, like the Consecrated Beast in the Abyss, which can make a shield a bit more, maybe not mandatory, but appreciated. Neuvillette is a character who, it is no secret, is just insane. I believe he's broken. He's the most consistent DPS through basically everything. He has great AoE, can still perform in single target, has great teammates, he has great weapon choices, both a free-to-play one and a good 5-star. He's very easy to build artifact-wise because you get so many stats like crit rate for free from the Maréchaussée Hunter set. He has a really high scaling and can kind of solo carry a team or an account, and also has pretty good vertical investment. He's someone who has a really strong first constellation, as I'll cover later, a pretty solid signature, and also good 5-star supports that can help upgrade his team, taking it to another level. Neuvillette is a great character on his own, but definitely has room for upgrades and gets better with some of the strongest supports in the game, namely Furina, Kazuha Shilonen, and even Zhongli. These characters help elevate his teams to greater heights, but as we'll cover later in the video, he does have a lot of different team options for every player. At a baseline though, I believe he's just insane, and one that I can highly recommend if you want a DPS on your account. Now, with that in mind, I have to point out that as far as DPSs go, many of them can be very strong and more than strong enough to clear content you're doing. So DPS wise, I recommend you get someone whose playstyle you enjoy and build them accordingly. You don't want to have a DPS character who you don't have fun with just because they're good and end up regretting it later. Personally though, I find Neuvillette relatively satisfying to play. You are kind of doing the same thing, like just beaming down enemies over and over, but his damage is so high that he's just absolutely insane. If you want him, like him, or even just want a strong DPS, Neuvillette will be my #1 recommendation as far as strong DPSs go as of right now. Alright, now with that out of the way, let's talk about how to actually build your Neuvillette. Firstly, for your artifact sets, it is very straightforward. What you're going to be looking for as your best in slot set is going to be the Maréchaussée Hunter. This set gives you so many useful stats on Neuvillette, like notably 15% charge attack damage on the 2-piece and up to 36% crit rate on the 4-piece. This 36 crit rate will come passively as your HP is increasing or decreasing, which is something that Neuvillette can do very easily even on his own. This is because, as we saw, his charge attacks will drain his HP when he has a lot of it and then healing it back up when he's under half HP, meaning that his HP will constantly be increasing or decreasing, triggering this effect reliably. Maréchaussée Hunter is better than any other set you can run, but if you don't have the set and don't want to farm it, other alternatives include 4-piece Heart of Depth, which is usually the best other 4-piece, around 10% or so behind, being fine as it'll give you hydro damage bonus and charge attack damage bonus, so it's okay. And if not, you can mix and match 2-piece sets of HP percent and or hydro damage bonus. Generally though, while these are viable alternative sets, nothing is as good as the 4-piece Maréchaussée Hunter, which is just an incredible DPS set on almost anyone that can run it, Neuvillette especially, as he can even make use of the charge attack damage bonus you're gaining on top of the huge amount of crit rate. Now for the stats you want on Neuvillette, here's what you need to know. Firstly, as an HP scaling main DPS, you will be looking for HP percent, crit rate, and crit damage on virtually every single piece. Regarding energy recharge, this is also nice to get, or rather it's important to use Neuvillette's burst every rotation, not just for the damage it deals, but much more importantly for the source water droplets that it generates. Now, in order to use his burst every rotation, Neuvillette typically doesn't need that much ER, depending on your weapon. In fact, if you're running either his signature weapon or the free-to-play prototype Amber, both of which we'll cover in the next section, you really won't need much energy recharge at all, if any. In fact, you will only need around 100 to 120% ER with either of those weapons, whereas if you're running any other weapon, then you will need a bit of energy recharge, namely around 120 to 150, depending on your team. As always with ER requirements, this will vary heavily based on your rotation, team, and the content that you're doing, but generally Neuvillette as a character doesn't need too much ER. A lot of his weapon options help alleviate it, and even without them, if you're running just a generic weapon that gives you a lot of offensive stats, you will only need a bit of energy recharge on your substats here and there. Neuvillette is a character who spends a lot of time on field, can use his skill twice per rotation, and can run a lot of efficient batteries such as Furina and Fischl, which all help alleviate his ER needs by quite a bit. Overall though, once you can use your burst every rotation, the main thing you're looking for everywhere is just offensive stats, being crit damage, crit rate, and HP percent. Regarding crit rate, keep in mind you are gaining 36 from the Maréchaussée Hunter set, so make sure to consider that when you are looking at your stats, and outside of that, it's very straightforward. Now as for your main stats, here's what you need to know. For your sands, you definitely want to go for HP percent, being your best overall, and then for your goblet and circlet, there are more than one option. For your goblet, typically hydro damage bonus is the best and general option. With that in mind, it's worth noting that an HP percent goblet can be viable as well, and typically only slightly worse. Additionally, if you are running a weapon that gives him a lot of damage percent, like namely his signature Tome of the Eternal Flow or even Lost Prayer, and have a support that also gives him a lot of damage bonus, such as Furina and maybe even Kazuha, then you can reach a level of damage percent that your Neuvillette is gaining, where getting more HP instead of hydro damage bonus on your goblet can actually be about as good or slightly better. And so typically, while I'd say that a hydro damage bonus goblet is your general go-to option, an HP goblet can be viable as well, and if you do have a lot of sources of damage percent and are on his signature weapon, then it can be about as good, sometimes like 1 or 2% better, but generally about as good as a hydro damage bonus goblet, which is great because it means that you can choose whichever goblet you have between hydro and HP that has better substats. On a somewhat similar note, regarding Neuvillette's circlet choices, here generally Naturally, crit damage will be the most popular because you're getting a lot of crit rate from the Mavuika Hunter set and ideally on your substats as well. With that in mind, you might still be low on crit rate, so if you really don't have enough, then the crit rate circlet is definitely viable as well. So you can choose either crit rate or crit damage based on what you need more of for your Neuvillette to help balance his ratio, factoring in the 36% crit rate you get from the Mavuika Hunter set. With that in mind, you can also run an HP percent circlet. Note that it will be a bit worse than running a crit circlet, so it's less recommended than, for example, an HP goblet. But if you have really good substats on an HP circlet and you do desperately need more HP on your Neuvillette, then going an HP circlet can definitely be viable as well, and typically only slightly worse than going for a crit circlet. Keep in mind though that if you already have an HP goblet and sands, going for an HP main stat on every single piece can end up giving you diminishing returns and will perform worse. And now next up, let's talk about Neuvillette's best weapons and which one you should choose. Now luckily, Neuvillette's a character who has really good weapon options for every type of player, a great 5-star, a great battle pass option, and also a great free-to-play choice, which means that everyone can have a good weapon for Neuvillette. Now firstly, to talk about his signature weapon, Tome of the Eternal Flow, this is his obvious best in slot. This weapon will give you 88% crit damage on its stat line, followed by 16% HP, 42% charge attack damage, as well as some bonus energy that you're restoring. What this means is that firstly, the energy part of this weapon's passive will alleviate your energy recharge needs for the most part, allowing you to run almost no energy recharge, or in some teams even zero, which is nice and allows you to build for more damage. On top of that, you get some HP, a ton of charge attack damage bonus, which is the main part of your damage, and then a lot of crit damage as well. This weapon is obviously tailor-made for Neuvillette and is great, but it is worth pointing that especially compared to some of the signature weapons of the newer characters that have been coming out recently, Tome is not as big of a damage increase compared to some of his other best options that can actually perform somewhat similarly. So while the weapon is great and you definitely can get it if you want a good option, I even chose to get it, it is worth noting that other weapon options can perform very well also, as we'll see in the weapon ranking, so don't feel forced to get his signature. In fact, the Sacrificial Jade, which is the battle pass weapon option, is a weapon that also can be great on Neuvillette as well, although it does have one problem you have to work around. In fact, this weapon will give you 36.8% crit rate, and then 32% HP at R1 and 64% HP at R5 from its effect, on top of some bonus elemental mastery. What this means is that Sacrificial Jade can be an extremely strong stat stick for your Neuvillette. The only thing you need to keep in mind and be careful of in practice is that you get so much crit rate from Sacrificial Jade that you might overcap when paired with the Mavuika Hunter set and however many crit rate substats you may have on your pieces. For that reason, while Sacrificial Jade is really good and makes it to where, especially at high refinement, you might not need to pull for a signature weapon, balancing your crit rate can be harder, as on your artifacts you now won't really be looking for crit rate as much and will try to focus on crit damage, HP percent, and a bit of ER. Starting at almost 80% crit rate without having to do anything makes it to where on one hand you can easily overcap on crit rate, but on the other hand, if you manage your stats efficiently and even if you're overcapping by just a little bit, Sacrificial Jade can be great, once again, especially with refinements, but still being strong even at R1. Now with that in mind, there are some other options that are great as well that don't require the battle pass, being both 5-star and 4-star options. Among those include Moalani's signature weapon Surf's Up that gives you crit damage and HP percent, being generally the second best 5-star for Neuvillette. And just behind Surf's Up include Cashflow Supervision, Kagura's Verity, and Lost Prayer. All of these are sort of stat sticks for Neuvillette, Lost Prayer giving you crit rate and elemental damage bonus, Cashflow Supervision giving you charge attack damage bonus and crit rate, with the other stats, namely attack percent, being wasted on him, but it's still good, and Kagura's Verity giving you a lot of crit damage. Lost Prayer being a standard catalyst is something to note, and even just generic HP percent catalysts like Jadefall Splendor or Everlasting Moonglow are viable on Neuvillette, with Jadefall being pretty strong and Everlasting Moonglow being outclassed by other options. Now speaking of HP percent weapons, the main one I want to talk about is actually the Prototype Amber. Prototype Amber is a solid stat stick for Neuvillette because it gives you HP percent on the stat line and then an effect that will give Neuvillette some energy back on top of healing HP to all of his party. Gaining energy back every 2 seconds for 6 seconds, so 18 energy at R5, is great because it's a weapon that you can craft and refine for free, get a lot of HP, and get a lot of energy, allowing you to not need energy recharge on your stats anymore. For those reasons, as well as its ease of use, it's typically your most recommended and best free-to-play option, on top of also being just one of your best options in general. I recommend it over most other catalysts outside of the really strong 5-stars or the Sacrificial Jade. Now with that in mind, the new Wave Riding Whirl, which is a gacha 4-star, so it's kind of hard to get, is a new weapon that gives you energy recharge on the main stat, which is useful, but then the substat will weirdly give you a ton of HP. In fact, it'll give you up to 44% HP at R1 or 88% 50% at R5, which is just a lot of HP. For those reasons, if you manage to get this sort of new weapon banner limited 4-star gacha weapon at high refinements especially, it can be a very viable and very strong 4-star option for Neuvillette, being one of your best choices overall. Additionally, it is worth pointing out that Widsith is also a viable option, but it is worth noting that this weapon will be more inconsistent. Obviously, you get a lot of crit damage, and especially at R5, the elemental damage bonus you can get through its effect can be absolutely insane. With that in mind, you are getting one of 3 random effects, and the other 2 aren't as good. Attack percent is useless, and elemental mastery is nice if you're vaporizing or maybe even electrocharging, but it's not as big of a deal. So this is mostly a weapon that's recommended for speedrunning or if you don't have a better option. Now, it is worth pointing out that even though only one of the 3 effects is really that good, with one of them being completely useless, the average damage that your Widsith will do will still be pretty fine just because of how good this one stat can be, on top of also giving you crit damage as a baseline. So while it's not the most recommended option, it can be nice for kind of reset spamming and speedrunning, or just another viable option you can use if you want and don't have better ones. Additionally, I wanted to mention that other free-to-play options exist, namely the new Ash Graven Drinking Horn, which gives you HP percent on the stat line and then an extra hit of damage scaling with your HP. This weapon can be decent, and it can perform similarly to Prototype Amber, giving your Neuvillette more raw stats and more of just a quote-unquote DPS increase. But what Prototype Amber gives you is some nice utility, like notably a lot of energy that can be reinvested into crit stats and HP for your party members. So I typically would choose the Prototype Amber over the event weapon, but it's definitely a viable option as well if you got it and refined it during the event. Outside of that, other free-to-play HP catalysts exist, like Ring of Yaxch, which is mostly just for HP. The effect doesn't really help, so it's not recommended. And Thrilling Tales, which yes, gives you HP and allows you to buff another character with attack, which makes it oddly viable, but it's not as recommended, as Neuvillette will be the main carry in your team. Alright, now with that out of the way, I'm going to include 2 weapon rankings on screen now to help give you guys a general idea of what weapons you should choose. The reason I'm including 2 weapon rankings is because the left one assumes a bit of a higher ER requirement, with the right one assuming a lower one. Obviously, how much ER you need will depend on your team and weapon, so keep that in mind. And also, the left ranking doesn't have Wriothesley's weapon, so I wanted to include another one in case you wanted to see where it ranks. For the most part though, Tome of the Eternal Flow, Sacrificial Jade, and Prototype Amber are the standard 3 options, with other 5-star stat sticks being great as well. I also wanted to point out that if you don't need as much energy recharge, Ash Graven Drinking Horn can technically be your best free-to-play option, but Prototype Amber's ease of use and ER requirement alleviation is something that I value highly, and a special thanks to both Suggest77 and Caramielle for the weapon rankings you're seeing. Alright, now next up, let's talk about Neuvillette's Constellations, and more importantly, his sort of upgrade priority as to upgrading him and his teams. So firstly, Neuvillette C1 is a pretty popular one that is very nice for Neuvillette. What it does is it'll firstly give him 1 free passive stack of his first passive talent, which will allow him to get the highest scaling increase to his charge attacks while only running 2 different elements on his party and only triggering 2 different hydro reactions. What this means in practice is that in his best teams, where Neuvillette is being ran alongside Farina, you are not penalized for running double hydro, even though it's still great without this constellation. You now will get the max damage bonus and effectively only triggering 2 different hydro reactions, like maybe Hydro Swirl and Crystallize. Outside of that passive stack, the second part of this constellation will also give Neuvillette a good amount of interruption resistance while he's using his empowered charge attack. What this means is that this constellation is now a comfy one on top of a damage increase. The interruption resistance is nice because you no longer really need a shield or form of defensive utility at all, as while it's not needed at C0, as we'll see in the team section, it is nice to have a more comfy playstyle and not have to worry about your charge attacks being interrupted. Now, regarding his first constellation versus his signature weapon, here will highly depend on what team you're running and what weapon you have. Now, his signature weapon, Tome of the Eternal Flow, can be quite a bit better than his free-to-play option, Prototype Amber, but not that much better than a high-refined Battle Pass weapon. So this begs the question of what weapon do you have? If you are running the free-to-play option, his signature weapon can be better than his first constellation damage-wise, whereas if you have a strong 5-star or the Sacrificial Jade, especially an R5 one, then his first constellation will be quite a bit better. Outside of just that though, his first constellation is one that can gain or lose value depending on who you are and the team you're running. What I mean by this is if you value interruption resistance highly and can use the extra passive stack, notably if you're running Neuvillette with another Hydro like Farina, which again is going to be a part of a lot of his best teams, then the first constellation can be a good damage increase on top of a comfy constellation that I can recommend, generally more so than a signature weapon. With that said, if you're running a team that already has, for example, 4 4 different elements, and maybe you don't value the interruption resistance as much or already running a shield, then it can be a less useful constellation for you and a less recommended one. Oh, also, personally, I'm not a big fan of this current weapon banner because Tome comes with Vortex Vanquisher and some more mediocre 4 stars to say the least, although Fav is nice, so less of a fan of the banner, but his weapon is still obviously pretty good. So personally, I like C1 a bit more than his signature, as there are solid alternative weapons that you can run, but there are situations where his signature can be a better increase for you in damage, so keep that in mind and choose accordingly. In fact, as far as vertical investment goes, I don't value it higher than getting a good support, not just for your Neuvillette, but also for your account. Getting a character like Farina, Kazuha, or Shilonin, characters that are great for Neuvillette that we'll talk about in the upcoming team section, I would value as better additions to your account and even generally to your team's damage than just getting one constellation for your Neuvillette. With that in mind, his C1 is great and a really strong early stopping point if you want it. Now, outside of his C1, which I think again is his best early stopping point, for his other constellations, well, firstly, his C2 will give him up to 42% crit damage to his charge attacks. C3 and 5 will increase his talent levels, but C3 notably increasing his normal attack levels and not his skill. So pretty nice for Neuvillette, as this will contribute to a sizable increase in damage, making it a solid C3. C5 is less impressive as it's just for your burst, and C4 will give Neuvillette additional source water droplets when he's healed, which is nice, but really not necessary unless you're going for C6. Now, what C6 does is not just give you a lot more damage, but also increases the duration of your charge attack. I've played a C6 Neuvillette before, and you can kind of AFK for a few seconds, just letting your charge attack beam away at everything, consuming any source water droplets that are around him, and increasing how long your charge attack stays out for. It also will do a bit more damage, scaling with your HP, with this constellation having nice synergy with your C4 as mentioned. Overall, C6 is solid. If you are someone who cares about C6 characters, Neuvillette C6 is pretty comfy and pretty strong, with his C1 being a really strong early stopping point, as it is a good one, provided you are making use of it. Neuvillette, though, being such a broken DPS, is not a character who needs constellations if you don't want any, so do not feel forced to pull for them. Alright, now with that out of the way, let's get into one of the most important sections of the video regarding Neuvillette's best teams and best support options. This is probably the main reason why I wanted to make a new Neuvillette guide, because there really are a ton of new options that you can use. Now, the way I'm going to go through this section is by talking about Neuvillette's best support options, giving you guys a lot of different ones that you can use, as well as giving you his best teams and other team options that you can replicate. It is important to disclose though that Neuvillette's teams are very flexible, and you can basically use almost any strong generic support with this character. With that in mind, here's what you should know. Firstly, his passive that we talked about earlier will give him more damage when paired with different elements that can trigger different hydro reactions. Because of this, you're typically going to run multiple different elements in your team. Additionally, a lot of characters who can run buffing support sets or weapons should choose to do so alongside Neuvillette. Because his damage is so insane, buffing it is really important and will give you a lot of value given how much of your team's damage is being done by Neuvillette himself. For those reasons, running sets such as the Hero set, Verdest Inventor, Archaic Petra, or even Instructor, or technically Song of Days Past for some healers, can be really valuable to buff your Neuvillette's damage. The Hero set is incredibly broken if you're running a support from Natlan in your team who will give your Neuvillette 40% hydro damage bonus when they trigger a hydro reaction. I do also want to mention though that non-Natlan characters can still run this set, as they will still buff your Neuvillette just for a smaller amount. It's still worth running if you don't have a Natlan support on your team and are running another support character who does not have a better option. Supportive weapons as well, such as Favonius or others, can also be great to have for eligible support characters. Now, regarding specific teammates you can use, again, the sky is the limit, but I'm going to go through some of the strongest options based on their elements. Firstly, for Electro supports, Auroron is a nice hero set buffer who does some solid AoE damage as well. Fischl is incredible, especially in single target, but also just for applying Electro and dealing good damage. Beto is great, and her burst works with your charge attacks, so she can be nice against 2 or more enemies. And Kuki or a full EM Raiden Shogun can be great for Hyper Bloom as well, with Kuki just being pretty solid in general if you want a healer and someone to apply Electro around you. But keep in mind, you may have to stay closer than you otherwise would with Neuvillette, given how long his range is. Lisa can even be ran to reduce the defense of enemies, provided you have enough energy recharge. For Anemo options, Kazuha is definitely the best. He groups, he gives you a ton of EM and elemental damage bonus, and can run the Verdest Inventor set. With that in mind, other Anemo characters are also strong because they can run this same artifact set if you don't have a Kazuha available. Basically, any Anemo character can work here, but generic supports like Sucrose, Lynette, or Venti can all be fine, and so can a healer like Jean, Sayu, or Shanyun. For Hydra options, while this will make you lose out on 1 stack of your passive if you don't have your first constellation, it does give you the Hydro Resonance, which is nice for the HP buff, and also access to a character that may be strong. The main one who's absolutely worth it is Furina, for the reasons I mentioned earlier, but a ton of damage and damage buffs make her incredible and one of Neuvillette's best supports, one that I recommend to use if you have her. Outside of that, other options like Yelan for the damage bonus that she gives you, even though you can't make use of her rain arrows, can still be viable, and so can Child for the extra normal attack level that he gives you from his passive, even though you're not swapping into him. It's a bit of a weirder team. Child's kind of in jail here. You basically don't swap into him except to maybe trigger a supportive bows effect and a supportive artifact set, and the same can be said for almost any generic Hydra support, with Furina absolutely being the best. For Dendro options, you can run a defensive one like Baiju or Kirara, with Baiju being my personal favorite for a nice form of defensive utility and healing. Emily can be good in teams where you're also triggering burning, and Nahida can be nice if you're playing Hyper Bloom or a team that wants a lot of Dendro. For Pyro options, Xiangling is the main off-fielder if you're trying to vaporize, burgeon, or do anything like that. Dea can also be a solid option for the interruption resistance that her skill gives you, on top of also being able to run the instructor set, which is really nice for Neuvillette if you can trigger some vapes. Dea giving you the occasional vaporize and also defensive utility is great for a C0 Neuvillette. Outside of that, generic Geo sub DPSs like Chiori or Albedo can work, and Shilonen can be an incredible buffer for your Neuvillette that makes it into his best team DPS wise. Being able to run the hero set and give you a huge amount of res shred on top of also being a healer makes Shilonen a top priority support in general and also for Neuvillette. Kachina can be an underrated 4-star free-to-play replacement if you don't have Shilonen, just because she's efficient at running the hero set but doesn't give you that much else outside of just a bit of damage and crystallize. Now there are a ton of other options I can mention, defensive utility ones such as Zhongli, who's great for res shred and the best shielder generally speaking if you need one, on top of other ones that I already mentioned like Baiju and Kirara, and even Layla as another 4-star shielding option. Regarding defensive utility on Neuvillette, having a shield is nice to not get interrupted at C0. At C1 it's less needed, but some shielders give you buffs that can be appreciated like Zhongli. And regarding healers, you don't typically need one because Neuvillette can self-heal, manipulating his own HP, not depending on another healer to help keep him healthy. With that in mind, if you are running Furina in your team, while a healer is not necessary, it can help to heal your other party members who otherwise would stay at half HP because of Furina's HP drain. This can help you get stacks faster, which will translate to more damage on top of being more comfortable. Because of this, having a healer in your team when you are running Furina can be nice, although it is still not necessary. With that said, I want to reiterate that the sky's the limit for Neuvillette supports. All the characters that I mentioned and even some other ones that I don't have time to mention can work with Neuvillette provided they give you either buffs or damage. As far as his premium choices, Neuvillette's premium team does consist of running Furina, Kazuha, and Shilonen to maximize your damage, or Zhongli for a more defensive choice if you want a shield, especially at C0. These are his premium and strongest supports that give him so much damage and utility that they really make Neuvillette ascend to the next level. With that in mind, you definitely don't need all 4 of them to make Neuvillette work. He's great even without any of these characters and gets better with each upgrade you can give him. Also, if the Pyro Archon who comes out next patch has any form of supportive capabilities, which I don't know, it's too early, then she'll probably be usable with Neuvillette given how any support character is. Outside of just this premium team though, Neuvillette has other team options that I want to show you. The most popular variations of Neuvillette's teams are Neuvillette hyper carry ones where you're running these buffers to allow Neuvillette to just do as much damage as possible, and as I said, the sky's the limit here. Outside of just hyper carry teams and the premium one, you can build Neuvillette around basically any Hydro reaction. You can run Electro Charge alongside one or multiple Electro units, you can run 1 or 2 Electro supports, or even run Furina here as well, being able to run so many different options. You usually have room for a flex slot to buff your damage, buff different elements like Hydro and Electro through an Anemo character that can swirl, or a Geo one like Shilonen. Electro Charge teams are some that I personally enjoy, especially running double Electro if you only have access to 4-star characters, but it's just one of many other teams Neuvillette has. You can also run Neuvillette with Vaporize, allowing him to try to vape certain ticks of his charge attacks, as well as his burst, and just do some more damage that way. You can run an off-field Pyro like Xiangling, who's the fastest form of Pyro application that we have, and she can definitely enable him to get the occasional Vaporize. You can still run Furina in this team for the damage buffs and her own personal damage, but keep in mind that she will steal some Vaporizes and can apply a lot of Hydro. With that in mind, it's still fine provided any one of your party members is vaporizing. Something to keep in mind with Xiangling though is that she will need a lot of energy recharge in this team, so running a weapon such as the Favonius Lance can be incredibly beneficial. If you want your Xiangling to deal more damage, you can run Bennett here to give her buffs, but because Neuvillette is not an attack scaler, Bennett won't get as much value because his buffs don't affect Neuvillette. Outside of that, you can run incredibly flexible options here, like a generic Anemo or any other buffer that I mentioned. mentioned. Outside of just a vape team though, you can also play Neuvillette alongside Hyperbloom or even Burgeon, just running him with a fast off-field Dendro applier like Nahida, and then someone to trigger the reaction. This will typically be a full EM, Kuki, or Raiden for Hyperbloom, which generally is more recommended than Burgeon. This team can work fine and has a flexible last slot as well. One team that my good friend Jeff77 showed me that I played especially before Furina's release was a variation of a Hyperbloom team running a full EM Raiden Shogun who will trigger Hyperbloom from off field, Nahida to apply a ton of Dendro, and Dea to give you the instructor set, the occasional Burgeon, and also the occasional Vaporize, increasing your Neuvillette's damage while also giving you a field that prevents you from getting interrupted, being incredibly nice for a C0 Neuvillette. Outside of that, you can also run Neuvillette with a cryo support, maybe an Anemo one as well, in a more freeze-oriented team, keeping enemies frozen and just melting away at them. You can also run Neuvillette in a Nilou Bloom team alongside 2 Dendro supports, just as much off-field Dendro as you can get, with Neuvillette being on-field, melting everything. Now, as you can see, Neuvillette can really be ran with basically every single Hydro reaction. You really can run anything with him, provided there's a theme, or just have strong buffing characters that don't have anti-synergy with one another. Personally, I really like running Neuvillette in a hyper carry team. This is where I find that he shines very easily, but you really can run anything. Obviously, premium supports help him a lot, but even with just good 4-star options, solid buffers, running sets like Hero and Verdescent Venerer, he can do so much damage. I hope this section wasn't too long because there really was a lot to cover, and keep in mind that even some of the supports that I didn't mention, provided they do something for the team and maybe trigger a reaction that helps you get another stack of your passive, can be used alongside Neuvillette. Now, with that out of the way, let's now get into a showcase of my Neuvillette in the brand new Spiral Abyss, which actually changed since I started recording this video, so you'll get to see him in the newest Abyss. I will be playing him in his premium team because a lot of these supports came out somewhat recently, especially Shilonen and also Furina since my last Neuvillette guide, so I want to show his kind of new powerful supports alongside him in the new Abyss. Regarding my builds, let me actually show you really fast. All the characters on my team are C0 except Kazuo as his first constellation, but I don't really use it, so it doesn't really matter. And my Neuvillette is obviously C0 but does have his signature weapon, so C0 R1 on the Maréchaussée Hunter set, an HP Goblet, which is actually quite nice in this team, and pretty good substats overall to make him have a solid ratio when you factor in the bonus crit rate you get from the artifact set, Constellation 0, talent level 1088 in the new Spiral Abyss. So I hope you enjoyed the guide and I hope you'll enjoy the showcase. Let's go. And so yeah, overall Neuvillette is just a pretty amazing character who's clearly withstood the test of time. Keep in mind he's a character who gets better with the more investment you're giving him, with key supports that make his teams that much stronger, but in general, as just a standalone DPS, he's an incredible character if he's someone that interests you or if you want a main DPS. With that said, I hope this guide was helpful. Sorry that it's later than usual and longer than usual. I hope you appreciate the depth, and I'll try to be as early as possible for Mavuika, as I'm sure she's right around the corner. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed, and as always, I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace. 100k no vape? What the